Good evening and welcome. Let us start by sharing our screen. Okay, here we go. So we're going to continue our study of Bodhidut, the isolation meditation, with the teachings of Abraham Maimonides as researched by Rabbi Kaplan. And Abraham Maimonides is, of course, the son of Moses Maimonides, the Rambam. So very interesting. And we'll also discuss how to deal with problems encountered when meditating, such as trying too hard. That will be very interesting because that's a very common problem. Just as a reminder, over the next couple of weeks, our schedule will change. The next class is a week from this Wednesday, not next Sunday, but the following Wednesday, because Passover occurs over next weekend. And then the following class will also be on a Wednesday, because the end of Passover also falls on a weekend. And then we'll resume our Sunday classes on April 11th. This is on the emails and it's on the website, so you'll be all set. Keeping track of all the student questions that are being asked, and I'm researching them. The current ones include, I am curious why purchasing or repurchasing, what is that about? Konei HaKol, as says in the Amidah. What is God buying here, and who's he buying it from? Another question is, what does Judaism say about astrology, or might be referenced mazalot? And can the Messiah be a woman? Another question. So as I come across sources, I compile them, and when I get enough together, then we'll have a presentation. Okay, let's go into what Abraham Maimonides says. This is from the book Meditation on the Bible, which, as I mentioned, right here. This is the first book that Rabbi Kaplan wrote about meditation, Jewish meditation. It is a groundbreaker in terms of revealing the many meditative traditions we have in this nation. Okay, what does Abraham Maimonides have to say? Rabbi Kaplan starts by saying this. Although many authors use the term Bodhidut to refer to the meditative state, the word is most often used for the actual act of meditation, and many examples of this are found in the Kabbalistic literature. So Bodhidut is both the state you achieve when you meditate, and Bodhidut is actually the meditation itself that gets you to that state. And there are sources in Jewish mystical tradition which talk about it. The clearest expression of this, however, is found in the writings of Rabbi Abraham Maimonides, who was born in 1186 and died in 1237, son of the famed philosopher, codifier, and physician Moses Maimonides. So you can see right away that Rabbi Kaplan is going to a wide variety of sources to get his information about this meditative tradition. Rabbi Abraham Maimonides writes that there are two types of isolation, two types of Bodhidut, external and internal. We've heard this before. External isolation is nothing more than physical seclusion, but internal isolation refers to the meditative process, where one isolates himself both spiritually and mentally. Such meditation is seen as the highest of all practices, being the method used by the prophets to attain their revelation. So he's saying right away that this form of meditation, Bodhidut, is the highest form of meditation, and it was one used by the prophets. How do you like that? Okay. The prophets frequently engaged in physical seclusion, but the main purpose of such external isolation was as preparation for internal isolation or meditation, which brought one to the highest step on the ladder of revelation. Such a step of internal isolation is seen not only as a means to attain revelation, but as actually being the revelation itself. So the Nevi'im, the prophets, isolated themselves externally to get in the mood, to get in the frame of mind, to isolate themselves internally. And as we discussed last week, it's a form of meditation that we kind of practice at a very basic level, where you're separating yourself from your thought stream. And he says, such a state of internal isolation is seen not only as a means to attain revelation, but as actually being the revelation itself. We say that. We say that when we meditate, what the Buddhists call vipassana meditation, what he calls vipassana meditation is, we say the goal, the meditation is the act of separating yourself and returning to your focal point and not letting the thought stream pull you away. So Rabbi Abraham, quoted by Rabbi Kaplan, says, yeah, that's you're revealing, you are becoming more mindful that way. A number of biblical verses are seen by Rabbi Abraham as referring to such a meditative state. It is the perfection from within the heart for which King David prayed when he said, a pure heart create for me, O God. That's from the Psalms. It was also the attainment of Aseph, regarding which he's saying, my flesh and heart fade away, while God becomes the rock of my heart and my portion forever. These verses refer to the purity of the mind and heart when they are cleansed of all things other than the divine. When a person attains such a state, the divine essence is actually seen as entering the mind and dwelling in it. Okay, first of all, Asaph. This is from Wikipedia. It's actually, I think, from a Christian source. And the reason why I say that is because it uses this word to refer to God. And I haven't heard Jews do that. But nonetheless, I'm looking at it for factual information. Okay, so it's describing Asaph. Now, there apparently is a person named Asaph who authored 12 Psalms. In the entire book of Tehillim, there's way over 100. 12 seem to be authored not by King David. We have a tradition that it was King David, but by Asaph. And there's one idea that says he's either the author or the transcriber of these Psalms. Did King David really say them and he transcribed them? We don't know. We're not going to get into that right now. And it talks a little bit more about his lineage. Okay. That's for another time. But the point here is that Rabbi Kaplan quotes one of his Psalms that refers to having a God becoming the rock of your heart. And Rabbi Kaplan says that that means that the divine essence enters your mind and dwells in it. Okay. And Rabbi Kaplan continues, the method through which this is attained, this meditative state, is also clearly described. This level is achieved through a cessation of activity on the part of the perceptive faculty completely, or at least for the most part, divorcing it from the soul. The motivating force of the consciousness is thus divorced from all worldly concepts and is inclined toward the divine. The intellect then becomes enveloped in the divine, and the imagination, which is associated with the meditative faculty, becomes activated through contemplation of God in God's creation, gazing at the mighty things that bear witness to their creator. Okay, so point number one is he's talking about a complete cessation of physical activity so that you can focus inwards, which reinforces an idea that we have said repeatedly, which is if you want to go deep in meditation, your body has to be still. And that's why seated meditation is often used for that, because when you're seated, you have less to worry about with your body than if you're standing. Okay. And then he goes on to talk about, your intellect becoming enveloped in the divine. And these are higher concepts which we should be able to approach at some point. The main method of meditation, as outlined by Rabbi Abraham, thus involves the contemplation of nature. Okay, why? Because Rabbi Abraham has been quoted as saying that you need to contemplate God's creation. So therefore, when you separate, it's not just a question of being isolated, it's a question of being isolated in a certain place. You can contemplate the works of Hashem. And Rabbi Nachman also talks about the same thing we mentioned last week, that he did Bodhidut. He practiced isolation meditation out in nature. A person can contemplate the greatness of the sea, marveling at the many creatures that live in it. One can gaze at a clear night sky, allowing his mind to be completely absorbed by the glory of the stars. Through such intense contemplation, one can attain a meditative state directed towards the divine. That's, of course, if you believe in the divine, meaning that God created the universe. That would be my question to Rabbi Kaplan. To what extent do you need to have prior belief system in order to appreciate the divine and the creation? There are people like pagans who would not say that. I think you need to have some kind of education in order to have that hashkafa, that perspective. So that shows how education and the programming of your mind influence your ability to achieve higher spiritual levels, because you need to have some kind of perspective on what you're doing. So this meditative state directed towards the divine is seen as the level of Aseph, one of the co-authors of the Psalms, who purified his heart and mind, cleansing it of all things other than divine. So according to Rabbi Kaplan's research, this Aseph was quite the spiritually enlightened person. It is regarding this state that he said, "My flesh and heart fade away." When he divorced his consciousness from everything but God, he said, "Who have I in heaven? And with you I have no desire in earth." Okay, so Aseph is held by Rabbi Kaplan in his research to be quite the spiritually enlightened person who achieved a high level of consciousness, maybe even akin to what the prophets did. And it's from that level of consciousness that he wrote these 12 Psalms. Although, Rabbi Kaplan continues, although the entire psalm is not discussed, many of the verses can readily be seen to refer to the meditative state, and indeed it is so interpreted by some of the most important classical Judaic commentators. It is therefore enlightening to look at the entire last part of this psalm and see the two quoted verses in context. So I'll read that. It's just a few lines. He's quoting Psalm 73. I am continually with you, God. You have grasped my right hand. With your counsel, you guide me. After glory, you take me. Who have I in heaven? With you, I have no desire on earth. My flesh and heart fade away. God becomes the rock of my heart, my portion forever. For me, closeness to God is good. I have placed my essence in God, my Lord, to express all your transcendence. So, very high level of understanding here. But what I think is noteworthy is that we commonly talk a lot of times with Tehillim, we're talking about an emotional need. We're talking about God, I'm feeling this, please guide me type of thing. You're putting yourself at God's disposal from you personally. But what Aseph is talking about here is that it's not just his own personal needs or fears. He's saying, on my entire essence, it's like an existential thing. My whole physical being, my whole, my meanness, I'm putting at your disposal, not just specific needs, but here I am. I'm transcending my ordinariness, so and putting it at your disposal so I can get close to you. So that's a higher level of cleaving to God. Numerous other biblical verses are also interpreted in this light. Thus, regarding the inclination of his consciousness toward the divine, the prophet Isaiah said, "Your name and your remembrance are the desire of my soul. My soul longs for you by night. Also my spirit within me dawns forth to you." The psalmist likewise said, "My soul thirsts for you, my flesh pines for you." And in another place, "My soul cleaves after you." And I think it's really important to reinforce again that we're not really talking about emotional needs here. We're talking about spiritual needs, and the difference is that the goal is to not feel more secure. The goal is to have a more spiritually profound experience. So Rabbi Kaplan, in his examination of this tradition of Hitbodedut, per the writings of Abraham Maimonides, is basically taking a new look at Tehillim here that is different than the look people usually take to Tehillim. Another example is this, when there's unfortunately somebody very sick or something very bad happening in a community, people say to him, "Save us, save us, save us." That's not being said for spiritual elevation. It's being said for salvation. It's like a petition for God to come through like a hero. From this perspective, from the meditative perspective, it's different. It's the individual wants to attain a higher level of consciousness and his experience of the world be enriched. Another important point discussed by Rabbi Abraham is that all ego and sensation must be restrained before the meditative faculty can function. An example of this is seen in Elisha's advice to Gehazi. He's talking about Malachim Beit in the book of Kings. "If you meet a man, do not bless him, and if a man blesses you, do not answer him." This is particularly noteworthy since it seems to indicate that a certain degree of stoicism is necessary before one can adequately engage in meditation, a concept that is discussed at length by the Kabbalists. I'm not sure what Rabbi Kaplan is saying about this one sentence in the second book of Kings. I don't know how that implies stoicism or the cessation of your ego, to tell you the truth. That's something to be studied. But what he's saying is, I think the Buddhists would say, and the people that practice this Vipassana meditation, I think they would say you have to quiet your ordinary mind so that it's not all about me type of thing, which is true, meaning that you have to rise above your ordinary concerns and thoughts in order to have an elevated experience. Okay. Now here's something very interesting. In order to attain the meditative state which unifies man and God, the prophets and their disciples would make use of various types of music and song. Rabbi Abraham writes that this would motivate the consciousness toward God and purify one's inner being of all external thoughts. There are a number of verses that mention this, one of the clearest being what is written with regard to the temple service. This is from Divrei Hayamim, the book of Chronicles. And it says, "David and his overseer singled out the sons of Asaph, Heman, and Jeduthun, who would prophesy with harps, lutes, and cymbals." So this quotation from the book of Chronicles is actually referring to prophets meditating through music, and and in particular with three instruments, harps, lutes, and cymbals. and that music helping them transcend their ordinary mind and be receptive to some kind of prophecy or some kind of spiritual enrichment. In order to be able to attain internal isolation, the prophets and their disciples also engaged in external isolation, secluding themselves from the general populace. They were then not disturbed by the mundane affairs of the multitudes and could meditate on God and his works without interruption. Such isolation could be partial and temporary, or it could be total, where the individual secluded himself in unpopulated areas such as deserts and mountains. Rabbi Abraham notes that such seclusion is often mentioned in the careers of the prophets and their disciples. It is also for this reason that many patriarchs and prophets worked as shepherds, where they could be alone in the fields for long periods of time. During such periods of isolation, the prophet would contemplate the sky and the mountains, as well as all the rest of God's works, drawing his mind to their creator. According to Rabbi Abraham, this is the meaning of King David's statement, "How weighty are your meditations, O God, how great is their sum. If I could count them, they would outnumber the sands." That's from Psalms. One becomes so immersed in his contemplation that he enters a state of trance and mental quietude, perceiving the unity of God like one who can actually sense it. When a person who has attained such a state is aroused, the spell of this unity remains with him. And David thus concludes, "I awakened and I was still with you." Now, we looked at Siebold last week, Stephen Siebold, who talked about isolation practices by current high achievers, people who strive for excellence. And he talked about going into this isolation tank, if you recall, where you're in this like case and you're floating on Epsom salts and for an hour or whatever, and you're depriving yourself of external sensation so that you can go inwards. I guess that's a method, and he mentioned how that helps people refrain from over cognating, thinking too much and quieting the mind. Very good. But I think if you contrast that against what Rabbi Abraham's saying, Rabbi Abraham's talking about, yeah, isolation, but as opposed to just being in a box, you should be out there. Why? Because from a Jewish point of view, at the end of the day, we need to stimulate our awareness of God. And by putting ourselves in a natural environment, we are putting ourselves in a position where we can be aware of God because of the wonder of his creation. I think it would be a lot harder to do that in an isolation tank, floating in Epsom salts. So, but then from a secular point of view, he's not talking about getting closer to God through that practice. He's talking about just going internal, which is important. Now, the best time for such meditation is at midnight or before dawn. Rabbi Abraham finds allusions for this in such verses as, "Rise, meditate in the night at the beginning of the watches." That's from Eicha, Lamentations. King David likewise said, "Before my eyes are the night watches when I meditate on your word." The younger Maimonides, Rabbi Abraham, also speaks of some individuals who attempt to go without sleep completely, attempting to emulate the devotion described in the verses, "I will not give sleep to my eyes or slumber to my eyelids." What's also interesting I want to add is that in my Kung Fu practice, we talk about the cycles, the energy cycles of the earth, and that midnight and when at daybreak are very good times to both meditate and also to practice physically, very active physically, because the earth cycle is at very yin, very receptive, and not as overpowering as it is at midday, the hottest day, when the sun's at the hottest part, when the day's at its hottest part, because that wears you down. There's too much energy. So it's kind of interesting that similarly, Rabbi Abraham says that those are good times to do the heat bodedut. Of great importance is Rabbi Abraham's discussion of the Muslim dervishes or Sufis, with whom he was apparently quite familiar. He describes a practice of one of their sects where individuals would meditate in dark places, secluding themselves to such an extent that their sense of sight degenerated and they can no longer discern between light and darkness. In order for an individual to engage in such practices, he notes, one must be motivated by a strong inner light so as not to be troubled by external darkness. A certain Abraham the saint is quoted as discussing such meditation in dark places. I don't know who this Abraham the saint is, and applying it to the verse, who among you fears God, obeying the voice of his servants? Such a man walks in darkness without any light. He trusts in the Lord and depends on his God. That's from Isaiah. Even though meditation is best accomplished when one is secluded, an individual or on an advanced spiritual level can engage in it at any time. The younger Maimonides thus quotes a blessing frequently used by the great sages. May God grant your portion among the ones who delight in seclusion, whose soul is isolated even among many people. So it's so interesting. He took a meditative approach to the interpretation of that verse and said, when we're talking about your soul being isolated among many people, we're not talking about what somebody might say, loneliness, or feeling out of it, or feeling alienated. It's not an emotional thing. This guy's meditating. And he's an advanced meditator because he's able to meditate. He's able to detach himself from his thought stream while among others and having to maintain awareness of where he is and who he is in the group. Besides their value in providing important insights into meditation in general, these writings of Rabbi Abraham Maimonides are also extremely valuable because of the light that they shed on the writings of his father, the famed Moses Maimonides, the Rambam. Although the son is not as well known, the father was one of the greatest of all Judaic thinkers, who distilled all earlier teachings and influenced virtually every later writer, that's for sure. From here, we clearly see that when Maimonides uses the term hid boded, he is actually speaking of meditation, a fact that has escaped the notice of almost every translator. A good example of such usage can be found in a letter that the elder Maimonides writes to his son Abraham. He says, the first two covenants, meaning circumcision and the Torah, are upheld through the third, which is the Sabbath. The goal of all three is the purification of the soul, methodology, withdrawal, as well as meditation, meaning hibodedut toward God. But what is even more important is the fact that Maimonides speaks of hibodedut with respect to the prophets, saying that it was one of the important techniques to which they attained their highest level. From his son's writings, we clearly see that he is speaking of meditation. I do not know of a single translator, however, who appears to be aware of this fact. Amazing. So the Rambam is studied all over the place. And here, and as Rabbi Kaplan reports, nobody is interpreting the Rambam's teachings when he speaks about hibodedut as referring to meditation. But Rabbi Kaplan somehow got a hold of letters between the Rambam and his son Abraham, where they're very clearly talking about meditation. So now if you go back to the Rambam's teachings, like, wow, this man understood meditation. I feel certain to say he was a meditator. How else would he know about it? So how many people would say, yeah, the Rambam meditates? I never came across until he said so. This also sheds light on an important teaching regarding meditation that is found in Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed. Since we know the meaning of the word hitbodedut, we can now translate it correctly. It is written, let me just see this. Right. It is written, because he's quoting the Rambam, I think. Love the Lord, it is written, says the Rambam, love the Lord your God and serve him with all your heart and with all your soul. You know, he's saying the Shema, with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your might. We have already demonstrated numerous times that the love of God is identical with one's perception of him. As a result of this love, one is led to a state of worship, which our sages call service of the heart. In my opinion, this means that one should concentrate all of his thoughts on the first intellect, meditating on it according to his ability. So the Rambam is, according to Rabbi Kaplan's understanding of the Rambam, which includes that the Rambam understood meditation. When we're talking about things like saying the Shema, we have to meditate on what it means to serve God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. As best you can, according to your ability. So the Rambam, according to Rabbi Kaplan, is saying we should meditate when we say the Shema, or at least prior to saying the Shema, so we really understand what it means to be, so we can really understand what it means to be close to God and love him. Meditation is the route to effectively saying the Shema. And I think he's continuing to quote the Rambam. It has thus been demonstrated that one's aim, after having attained enlightenment, should be to give oneself over to God and make his intellect yearn for him at all times. In most cases, this is accomplished through seclusion and isolation. Every pious individual should therefore strive for seclusion and meditation, hitbodedut, not associating with others except when absolutely necessary. And he wraps it up. The pious were therefore particular to minimize the time when they could not reflect on God's name. And they cautioned others, saying, let not your minds be vacant from reflections on God. In the same sense, King David said, I have set God before me always. He is at my right hand. I shall not be moved. That's from Tehillim. What he meant was, I do not turn my thoughts away from God. He is like my right hand, which I do not forget, even in an instant, because of the ease of its motions. Therefore, I shall not be moved. I shall not fail. So here, the seclusion necessary for hitbodedut allows you to always be mindful of God. You minimize your distractions from your environment, from people, and you're therefore, your focus is available to focus on God and getting close to him. Okay, let's see the time. All right. Next week, we're going to wrap up with additional sources in Torah that talk about hitbodedut. And we'll wrap up this hitbodedut section with this fascinating, thorough research that Rabbi Kaplan did, and to different commentators and philosophers, all of whom refer to hitbodedut. And by the way, we mentioned enlightenment. He referred to enlightenment earlier. That's a very hot word when it comes to spiritual growth and to me meditating. The next tradition we're going to be looking at is enlightenment, at least the Jewish version of it. So stay tuned for that. Okay. So let's now talk about getting better at meditating and the best practices with Bante. And the problem we'll address today is trying too hard. This is what he has to say. Advanced meditators are generally found to be pretty jovial people. If you meditate a lot, you're not going to be all wound up tight. They possess one of the most valuable of all human treasures, a sense of humor. It is not the superficial, witty repartee of the talk show host. It is a real sense of humor. They can laugh at their own human failures. They can chuckle at personal disasters. Beginners in meditation are often too serious for their own good. It is important to learn to loosen up in your session, to relax in your meditation. You need to learn to watch objectively whatever happens. You can't do that if you are tensed and striving, taking it also very, very seriously. We talked about many times the importance of physically being loose and relaxed, structured but loose and relaxed, because the tension is going to be distracting. And similarly, he's saying you got to be relaxed in your mind. New meditators are often overly eager for results. They are full of enormous and inflated expectations. They jump right in and expect incredible results in no time flat. They push, they tense, they sweat and strain. And that is also terribly, terribly grim and solemn. This state of tension is the antithesis of mindfulness. Naturally, they achieve little. Then they decide that this meditation is not so exciting after all. It did not give them what they wanted. They chuck it aside. It should be pointed out that you learn about meditation only by meditating. You learn what meditation is all about and where it leads only through direct experience of the thing itself. Therefore, the beginner does not know where he is headed because he has developed little sense of where his practice is leading. The novice's expectation is naturally unrealistic and uninformed. Newcomers to meditation expect all the wrong things, and those expectations do no good at all. They get in the way. Trying too hard leads to rigidity and unhappiness, to guilt and self-condemnation. When you are trying too hard, your effort becomes mechanical, and that defeats mindfulness before it even gets started. You are well advised to drop all that. Drop your expectations and straining. Simply meditate with a steady and balanced effort. Enjoy your meditation and don't load yourself down with sweat and struggles. Just be mindful. The meditation itself will take care of the future. And I think you can appreciate the fact that what he just said applies to anything. You get all bound up in the results, then you're going to be all impatient. And you'll quit, or at least you'll be miserable, and nobody wants that. Okay, so on that note, we're going to meditate. We will stop recording.